The astonishing and profoundly inspiring story I'm about to tell you began on an ordinary Thursday evening in November, precisely at 6:30, when most office workers were heading home after long days at their desks, dreaming of dinner and relaxation and time with family or friends. But when 31-year-old Natalia Ferreira was just settling in for what would turn out to be the longest and most extraordinary night of her entire career, working as personal assistant to Rodrigo Martinez, a 46-year-old self-made technology entrepreneur who had built a billion-dollar software company from a startup he launched in his garage 15 years ago, through a combination of brilliant innovation, aggressive business tactics, and a work ethic so intense that he regularly expected his employees to match his own commitment to putting company success above absolutely everything else, including health, relationships, and personal well-being. Natalia had been working as Rodrigo's executive assistant for 3 years, having been promoted from a junior administrative position after demonstrating exceptional organizational skills, unflappable composure under pressure, and willingness to work whatever insane hours Rodrigo demanded without complaining or pushing back even when his requests were unreasonable or his treatment of staff was harsh and dismissive. Rodrigo was preparing for what was potentially the most important business presentation of his career, scheduled for 8 o'clock the following morning Friday, with a consortium of international investors who were considering a massive $500 million investment that would allow the company to expand globally and dominate markets in ways that had previously been impossible due to capital constraints. Everything hinged on this presentation being absolutely perfect, on Rodrigo delivering a compelling vision with flawless data and graphics and financial projections that would convince these sophisticated skeptical investors that his company represented their best opportunity for extraordinary returns on their capital. Rodrigo had been working obsessively on this presentation for weeks, revising and practicing and refining every slide and every word, and he had insisted that Natalia remain available around the clock during the final days of preparation to handle any last-minute changes or emergencies that might arise as he perfected his pitch. That Thursday evening, Rodrigo was in his office tower headquarters putting final touches on his presentation materials when he made a devastating discovery that sent him into near panic. The critical financial projections that formed the backbone of his entire investment thesis had a major error in the underlying spreadsheet formulas that had propagated throughout all the calculations and charts and graphs, making his revenue forecasts appear significantly more optimistic than the actual data supported and potentially exposing him to accusations of intentional fraud or, at minimum, gross incompetence if investors discovered the mistakes during due diligence. The error was subtle enough that nobody had caught it during multiple reviews, but once Rodrigo saw it, he realized with sinking dread that virtually every number in his presentation was wrong and would need to be recalculated, and every slide showing financial data would need to be completely rebuilt from scratch, a task that would normally require at least 3 full days of intensive work by a team of financial analysts and presentation designers, but that somehow needed to be completed in approximately 12 hours before his 8 a.m. meeting. Rodrigo's first instinct was rage at the analysts who had created the faulty spreadsheet and at himself for not catching the error sooner during his numerous reviews. But the anger quickly gave way to cold calculation about how to solve this crisis without canceling the meeting, which would be seen as a sign of weakness and would likely kill the investment opportunity permanently. He called Natalia immediately and explained the situation in terse, urgent tones, telling her that he needed her to stay at the office all night if necessary to help him completely rebuild the presentation with correct numbers, that she should clear her personal schedule and plan to work straight through until the meeting the next morning, and that this was quite literally the most important project of her career, because if they failed to fix this and the meeting went poorly, she could forget about having a future at the company or getting good references for other positions. Natalia listened to Rodrigo's frantic instructions without showing the dismay she felt, and she immediately shifted into crisis mode, even though she had been looking forward to going home that that evening to celebrate her younger brother's 23rd birthday at a family dinner that her mother had been planning for weeks. What Rodrigo didn't know, because Natalia had never told him or any of her colleagues, maintaining strict boundaries between her professional and personal lives, was that her younger brother Lucas was developmentally disabled due to complications at birth that had caused brain damage, leaving him with the cognitive abilities of approximately a 7-year-old child, despite being physically an adult. Lucas lived in a group home for adults with disabilities during the week, but came home every weekend to stay with their mother and Natalia in the small apartment where they had lived for over a decade. And these family gatherings were the highlight of Lucas's life because he loved being with family, and especially loved his big sister Natalia, who had been his champion and protector and advocate throughout his entire life. The birthday dinner that evening was particularly special because Lucas had recently accomplished something difficult by completing a vocational training program that would allow him to work part-time at a grocery store with job coaching support, representing a major milestone toward greater independence that the family had been working toward for years, and that deserved celebration and recognition. Natalia's mother had called her that afternoon, excited and emotional about the dinner preparations, talking about Lucas's favorite food she was cooking and the small cake she had purchased, and how proud she was of her son's progress, and how much it would mean to Lucas to have his sister there celebrating with them, since Natalia was the person Lucas looked up to more than anyone else in the world. Natalia had promised her mother she would definitely be there by 7:30 at the latest, because she understood how important this was for Lucas, and how disappointed and confused he would be if she didn't show up for his birthday, and she had already bought him a thoughtful gift that she knew he would love, because it was related to his special interest in trains and transportation, which had been his obsession since early childhood. But now, with Rodrigo's crisis and his barely veiled threat about her future employment, depending on staying all night to fix this presentation, Natalia faced an impossible choice between professional survival and family obligation, between keeping her promise to her vulnerable brother and protecting her career and income that her family partially depended on, since she contributed significantly to household expenses and Lucas's care costs. Natalia made a decision in that moment that she would come to see as defining who she truly was and what her values actually were, despite years of allowing work to consume her life and dictate her priorities. She told Rodrigo firmly but respectfully that she understood the severity of the situation and would absolutely help him solve the crisis, but that she had a critical family obligation that evening for her brother's birthday that she could not and would not miss, because her brother had a disability and needed her presence, and she had promised him she would be there. She said she would work as late as possible before leaving for the dinner around 7, and then she would return to the office by 9:30 or 10 after the family celebration concluded, and would work through the entire night doing whatever was needed to fix the presentation, but that she was not willing to simply abandon her family without even showing up or explaining in person why she couldn't stay for the full celebration. She expected Rodrigo to explode in anger or to threaten her job immediately, but she had reached a point where she realized that if this job required her to be the kind of person who would break promises to vulnerable family members and prioritize corporate emergencies over human connection, then maybe it wasn't the right job for her, regardless of the pay or prestige or career advancement it provided. Rodrigo was indeed angry at Natalia's refusal to stay immediately and work straight through without interruption, and he started to say something harsh about her lack of commitment and questionable priorities. But something in Natalia's calm, firm tone and the mention of a disabled brother made him pause before launching into his prepared lecture about sacrifice and dedication to the company. Instead, he found himself asking in a slightly less hostile tone what kind of disability her brother had and why this particular birthday dinner was so important that it couldn't be rescheduled to accommodate this legitimate work emergency. Natalia briefly explained Lucas's situation and the significance of his recent vocational achievement, and how much her presence meant to him, particularly given his limited ability to understand or cope with disappointment and broken promises. And she acknowledged that she understood the work crisis was serious and that she was committed to staying all night after the dinner to help resolve it, but that she needed those 2 hours from 7 to 9:30 to honor her commitment to her brother. Rodrigo listened with visible impatience, but also with something that might have been grudging respect for Natalia's willingness to stand up to him and set boundaries even at potential cost to her career, and he finally agreed tersely that she could leave for her family dinner as long as she genuinely returned by 9:30 to work through the night as promised. Natalia thanked him sincerely and threw herself into working frantically for the next hour, doing as much preparation and organization as possible before she needed to leave, setting up systems and processes that would allow them to work efficiently when she returned later that evening. She left the office at 7 exactly and rushed home to find her mother and Lucas already celebrating, Lucas wearing a party hat and practically bouncing with excitement when Natalia walked through the door. The joy on Lucas's face when he saw his sister arrive as promised was so pure and unfiltered that Natalia felt tears prick her eyes at the thought that she had almost missed this moment, that she had seriously considered breaking her brother's heart by not showing up for his birthday because her boss demanded total availability without regard for her humanity or her family obligations. The birthday celebration was sweet and loving and exactly what Lucas needed, with him proudly telling Natalia all about his new job and showing her the name tag he would wear and describing with endearing enthusiasm the tasks he would be doing at the grocery store, like helping customers find items and stocking shelves and operating the cart return system. Natalia's mother shared with obvious emotion how far Lucas had come and how proud she was of both her children, praising Natalia for her career success and her ongoing support of the family, while also acknowledging the sacrifices she made by working such long hours and having so little time for personal life or rest. They sang happy birthday and ate cake and opened presents, and Lucas was thrilled with Natalia's gift of a detailed model train set that he could build and operate, already making plans for how he would arrange the tracks and which cars would go in which order. At 9:15, Natalia hugged her mother and brother goodbye and apologized that she had to return to work for the night, and Lucas surprised her by saying with simple, direct honesty that he understood she had important work and that he was just happy she had come for his birthday party, even if she couldn't stay longer. Natalia returned to the office at 9:25, finding Rodrigo still working frantically on rebuilding spreadsheets and looking stressed and exhausted, and she immediately jumped into helping him without bothering to take off her coat or get coffee or do any of the normal transition activities she might have done under less urgent circumstances. They worked side by side for the next hour, making solid progress on correcting data and regenerating charts, developing a rhythm of collaboration where Rodrigo focused on the complex financial calculations and strategic content, while Natalia handled the formatting and design and organization, ensuring everything was properly structured and visually compelling. Around 10:30, Rodrigo's phone rang with a call from his ex-wife, who was supposed to be watching their 10-year-old daughter Emma that night, and Natalia could hear from Rodrigo's side of the conversation that there was some kind of emergency or crisis that required his ex-wife to leave urgently and that she needed Rodrigo to come pick up Emma immediately because there was nobody else available to watch her on such short notice. Rodrigo argued strenuously that he absolutely could not leave his office right now because he was in the middle of a critical work crisis, and his ex-wife responded with obvious anger that she had her own emergency to deal with, and that regardless of his work obligations, he was still Emma's father and had responsibilities to their daughter that couldn't just be ignored whenever it was inconvenient. The call ended with Rodrigo agreeing through clenched teeth that he would pick up Emma within the next hour, and he sat staring at his computer screen with visible frustration about this additional complication that would cost him valuable time when he needed every minute to complete the presentation rebuild. Natalia watched Rodrigo's obvious distress about being forced to choose between his work emergency and his parental obligations, and she made another split-second decision that surprised them both. She told Rodrigo that if he needed to bring Emma to the office so he could continue working, she would be happy to help look after Emma and keep her comfortable and entertained during the night while they completed the presentation work, understanding from her own family situation how difficult it was to balance professional demands with responsibilities to children or family members who needed care and attention. Rodrigo looked at Natalia with obvious surprise and something approaching gratitude, and he accepted her offer while mentioning somewhat apologetically that Emma would probably fall asleep eventually, but tended to be anxious in unfamiliar situations, and might need some reassurance and patience, especially at this late hour when she was already tired. Rodrigo left to pick up Emma from his ex-wife's house and returned about 45 minutes later with a sleepy, cranky little girl who was wearing pajamas under her coat and carrying a stuffed animal and looking decidedly unhappy about being dragged out in the middle of the night and brought to her father's boring office instead of being in her comfortable bed at home. Rodrigo deposited Emma in his office and immediately returned to working on the presentation, clearly uncomfortable with the childcare situation, but not knowing what else to do under the circumstances. And Natalia took it upon herself to make Emma as comfortable as possible by finding blankets and pillows to create a makeshift bed on the sofa in Rodrigo's office, offering Emma some snacks and juice from the break room, and sitting with her for several minutes talking gently about school and interests and favorite things in an effort to help the anxious child relax in this strange nighttime environment. Emma gradually warmed to Natalia, who had a natural, gentle manner with children developed through years of caring for Lucas and understanding how to be patient and kind with people who needed extra support and reassurance, and after about 30 minutes, Emma had settled down considerably and was watching a movie on Natalia's tablet while snuggled under blankets on the sofa. Natalia returned to working with Rodrigo on the presentation rebuild, and they made excellent progress over the next several hours as midnight passed and moved toward 1 a.m. and then 2 a.m., both of them exhausted but focused and working efficiently together to solve the complex problems and ensure every number and chart and slide was perfect and ready for the critical morning meeting. Around 2:30, Emma woke up from her dozing and seemed upset and disoriented, and Natalia immediately went to check on her, discovering that the child was crying quietly and saying she didn't feel well and her stomach hurt badly. Natalia felt Emma's forehead and realized the child was burning up with fever, clearly sick with something more than just tired crankiness. And she alerted Rodrigo, who came over looking worried and frustrated about yet another complication interfering with his ability to finish the essential presentation work. Emma's fever was high enough to be concerning at 103 degrees Fahrenheit, and she was complaining of severe stomach pain and nausea in addition to being feverish and lethargic, symptoms that could indicate anything from a simple stomach bug to something more serious like appendicitis that might require immediate medical attention. Rodrigo was clearly torn between his responsibilities to his sick daughter and his desperate need to complete the presentation before morning, and Natalia could see him doing mental calculations about whether he could possibly take Emma to an emergency room and then return in time to finish the remaining work before his 8 a.m. investor meeting. Natalia made a decision that would transform not just that night, but potentially the trajectory of multiple lives, telling Rodrigo firmly that Emma needed medical attention immediately and that he should take her to the emergency room without worrying about the presentation, that she, Natalia, would continue working through the remaining items on their checklist and would complete everything that needed to be done before morning, even if she had to work alone through the rest of the night to make it happen. Rodrigo started to protest that Natalia didn't have the expertise to handle the complex financial calculations and strategic content that still needed work, but Natalia assured him that she would focus on the design and formatting and organization tasks she could definitely complete while leaving notes and placeholders for items that required his specific input and expertise, and that if necessary he could do final reviews and adjustments in the early morning after returning from the hospital, assuming Emma's condition wasn't so serious that he needed to stay with her longer. Rodrigo agreed with obvious reluctance and gratitude, and he gathered up his sick daughter and headed to the emergency emergency room, leaving Natalia alone in the office at almost 3 o'clock in the morning, facing several more hours of intensive work to complete a presentation that could determine the future of a billion-dollar company and potentially impact the jobs and livelihoods of hundreds of employees. Natalia worked steadily through the pre-dawn hours, her exhaustion kept at bay by determination and multiple cups of strong coffee, methodically checking off tasks and perfecting designs and ensuring every element of the presentation was polished and professional and compelling. She texted Rodrigo periodically to check on Emma and to ask critical questions about content decisions that required his input. And she learned that Emma had been diagnosed with a severe stomach infection that required IV antibiotics and would need to stay in the hospital for observation at least until midday, but that she was stable and not in immediate danger. Around 5:30 in the morning, when dawn was just beginning to lighten the sky outside the office windows, Natalia reached a point where she had completed everything she possibly could, working alone, and the remaining gaps in the presentation absolutely required Rodrigo's expertise and decision-making authority to finalize. She called Rodrigo at the hospital and explained the situation, telling him that the presentation was about 90% complete and that the remaining work could probably be finished in 60 to 90 minutes if he was able to come to the office to do final reviews and content creation. Rodrigo sounded exhausted and stressed when he answered, clearly having not slept at all while sitting at his daughter's hospital bedside, and he explained that he was torn about whether to leave Emma to finish the presentation or to cancel the investor meeting entirely because Emma was asking for him and seemed frightened by being in the hospital, and he felt guilty about potentially abandoning her again in favor of work priorities. Natalia listened to Rodrigo's conflicted explanations and made yet another extraordinary decision that would shock everyone who learned about what happened that night. She told Rodrigo that he should absolutely stay with Emma for as long as she needed him and not worry about the presentation or the investor meeting, that she, Natalia, would handle the meeting herself, presenting the materials to the investors on Rodrigo's behalf if he would trust her to do so. Rodrigo started to protest immediately that this was impossible, that these were sophisticated international investors who would never take seriously a presentation from an executive assistant rather than from the company's founder and CEO, that Natalia didn't have the technical expertise or business credibility to handle complex questions about technology and market strategy and financial projections, that it would be professional suicide to send someone of her relatively junior status to represent the company in such a critical meeting. But Natalia calmly and confidently explained that she had been intimately involved in preparing this presentation for weeks, that she understood the content and the business strategy probably better than Rodrigo realized, that she had watched him practice the presentation multiple times and knew exactly how he would position various arguments and respond to different types of questions, and that while she certainly wasn't as experienced or expert as he was, she could absolutely deliver a competent professional presentation that would at minimum keep the investment opportunity alive, even if it didn't immediately close the deal. Rodrigo was silent for a long moment, processing this completely unexpected offer, and Natalia could hear the conflict in his voice when he finally responded, saying that he couldn't ask her to do this and take such a huge professional risk on his behalf, that if the presentation went badly, she would be blamed and would potentially damage her own career and reputation, in addition to hurting the company. But Natalia told him honestly that she was choosing to offer this help not because he was asking or demanding, but because it was the right thing to do given the circumstances, that his daughter needed him more than the investors did right now, and that sometimes you have to make hard choices about priorities and trust other people to step up and handle responsibilities, even when the stakes are high and the risks are significant. She said that if he was willing to give her authority to represent the company for this meeting and to trust her judgment about how to handle the presentation and investor questions, she would do her absolute best to deliver results that would make him proud and that would keep the investment opportunity viable. Rodrigo made a decision in that moment that represented real growth and change from his previous patterns of needing to control everything and never delegating truly important responsibilities to anyone he considered beneath his level. He told Natalia that he trusted her completely and that he was authorizing her to present to the investors on his behalf, that he would send an email to the investors within the next hour explaining that he had a family emergency and that his senior executive, Natalia Ferreira, would be delivering the presentation with his full authority and confidence. He thanked her with emotion in his voice for her extraordinary commitment and support, not just for the company, but for his daughter Emma, acknowledging that Natalia had shown more genuine care and professionalism during this crisis than he had any right to expect, and that he would never forget her willingness to go so far beyond normal job responsibilities to help when it mattered most. They finalized the few remaining presentation items over the phone, with Rodrigo providing specific guidance and content, while Natalia implemented his instructions and perfected the final slides. And by 7 o'clock, the presentation was complete and ready. Natalia had approximately 45 minutes before the investors would arrive at 8 o'clock, and she used that time to shower and change into professional clothes she kept at the office for emergencies, to drink more coffee and eat something to give herself energy, and to review the presentation materials multiple times, practicing her delivery and preparing for possible questions she might face from skeptical investors who would definitely be judging her credibility and authority to speak on behalf of the company. At 7:55, the investors began arriving in the conference room. 6 men and 2 women from various countries representing hundreds of millions of dollars in potential capital, all clearly expecting to meet with Rodrigo and looking surprised and somewhat skeptical when Natalia introduced herself and explained that Rodrigo was dealing with a family medical emergency, but had asked her to present on his behalf with his complete authority and confidence. What happened during that presentation over the following 90 minutes was later described by several of the investors as one of the most impressive and professional business presentations they had ever witnessed, not because the content was revolutionary or because Natalia was a brilliant public speaker, though she delivered the material with clarity and conviction, but rather because of the authentic passion and commitment and deep knowledge she demonstrated about every aspect of the company and the investment opportunity. She handled complex technical questions with competence that surprised the investors who had assumed an executive assistant wouldn't understand the sophisticated technology and market dynamics underlying the business. She addressed financial concerns with transparency and specificity that built trust rather than trying to obscure or minimize challenges. She responded to skeptical pushback about competition and market risks with thoughtful analysis that acknowledged problems while also articulating clear strategies for addressing them. Most importantly, she demonstrated throughout the presentation a genuine belief in the company's mission and potential that was compelling because it came from someone with no personal equity stake or founder's ego to protect, just someone who had worked intimately with the business and the team and genuinely believed in what they were building. By the time Natalia finished presenting and answering questions, the investors were looking at each other with subtle nods and expressions that suggested they were impressed and interested, despite their initial skepticism about meeting with a junior executive rather than the CEO. The lead investor told Natalia directly that her presentation had been excellent and that they would be conducting final due diligence and discussing terms internally over the next week, but that they were definitely interested in moving forward with the investment at levels potentially exceeding what Rodrigo had originally requested. They asked to schedule a follow-up meeting with Rodrigo once his family situation stabilized, and they expressed genuine respect for a CEO who would prioritize his child's medical needs over a critical business meeting and who had executive team members capable of stepping up and representing the company so effectively in his absence. After the investors left, Natalia sat alone in the conference room for several minutes, processing what had just happened and feeling the exhaustion of having worked through the entire night, finally catching up with her now that the adrenaline and intense focus were no longer needed. She called Rodrigo at the hospital to report that the presentation had gone well and that the investors were interested in proceeding, and she could hear the relief and gratitude in his voice when he thanked her profusely and said he honestly didn't know how to repay her for everything she had done. Natalia simply said that she hoped Emma was feeling better and that Rodrigo should stay with her for as long as necessary without worrying about the office, and that Natalia was heading home to finally get some sleep after being awake for over 24 hours. The story of what Natalia had done during that extraordinary night spread rapidly throughout the company once Rodrigo began sharing details with senior executives and board members, and it sparked conversations about work-life balance and family priorities, and what kind of culture and values the organization truly wanted to embody. Several journalists covering the technology industry got wind of the story and wrote features about the executive assistant who had stayed up all night to save a billion-dollar investment deal, while simultaneously enabling her CEO to be with his sick child, framing it as an inspiring example of dedication and teamwork and proper prioritization of human needs alongside business objectives. The articles caught attention locally and then nationally as the story resonated with working parents and caregivers everywhere who constantly struggled with impossible choices between professional demands and family responsibilities, and Natalia found herself suddenly receiving interview requests and speaking invitations and recognition that felt surreal and overwhelming for someone who had simply been trying to do the right thing rather than seeking attention or accolades. Rodrigo was profoundly changed by the experience of watching Natalia demonstrate such extraordinary character and competence, while also forcing him to confront his own patterns of prioritizing work over literally everything else, including his daughter's needs and his employees' humanity. He began implementing significant changes in company culture, establishing clearer boundaries around work hours and after-hours expectations, creating more generous family leave policies and flexible work arrangements, and most importantly, modeling different behavior himself by being more present with Emma and actually leaving the office at reasonable times and treating personal and family commitments as legitimate priorities rather than inconvenient obstacles to maximum productivity. He promoted Natalia to a senior leadership position with compensation and equity that reflected her true value to the organization, and he made clear to everyone in the company that her advancement was based not just on the extraordinary night when she delivered the investor presentation, but on the consistent excellence and integrity she had demonstrated throughout her tenure. The relationship between Rodrigo and Natalia evolved over the following year from employer-employee into genuine friendship and partnership built on mutual respect and trust that had been forged through crisis and vulnerability. Rodrigo met Lucas and Natalia's mother and came to understand the challenges Natalia had been navigating while working such demanding hours, and he felt ashamed that he had been so oblivious to her personal circumstances and had never thought to ask about her life or family or what she might be sacrificing to meet his relentless demands for availability and dedication. He started supporting organizations that served people with developmental disabilities and became an advocate for workplace policies that accommodated caregiving responsibilities, speaking publicly about what he had learned from Natalia about priorities and values and what real leadership actually requires. The romantic dimension of the story developed slowly and naturally over approximately 2 years, as Rodrigo and Natalia continued working closely together and spending significant time in each other's company, both professionally and socially, as their families became connected through various activities and celebrations. There was genuine chemistry and attraction between them despite the age difference and the previous power imbalance in their relationship. But both were extremely cautious about pursuing romance given the potential complications and the importance of preserving their working relationship and professional reputations. Eventually, though, the connection became impossible to ignore or deny, and they began dating seriously while being thoughtful about maintaining appropriate boundaries at work and being transparent with colleagues and board members about their evolving relationship to avoid any appearance of favoritism or impropriety. Emma absolutely adored Natalia, who had become a trusted adult figure in her life, and Lucas thought Rodrigo was wonderful and enjoyed spending time with him, particularly because Rodrigo showed genuine interest in Lucas's train obsession and bought him special model trains and spent hours patiently helping him build elaborate track layouts. The extended families gradually connected and merged into something approaching a blended family structure, even before Rodrigo and Natalia's relationship became explicitly romantic, with holidays and celebrations including everyone and creating a sense of belonging and community that neither Rodrigo nor Natalia had experienced in years, given their previous patterns of isolation and prioritizing work over relationship building. When Rodrigo eventually proposed to Natalia approximately 3 years after that extraordinary night, he did so in a way that honored both their journey and their shared values, asking not just Natalia, but also Lucas and Emma and Natalia's mother for their blessing and support, because he understood that marriage meant joining families and communities rather than just two individuals forming a couple. The wedding was meaningful and joyful, bringing together Rodrigo's business world and Natalia's family and community in celebration of a relationship that had started in such unexpected circumstances and had grown into something genuine and lasting through mutual respect and authentic care for each other's well-being and happiness. Today, 5 years after that November night when Natalia chose to honor her commitment to Lucas's birthday and then chose to stay all night helping Rodrigo despite having every right to be angry about his unreasonable demands, Rodrigo and Natalia are married and have built a life together that balances professional success with family connection and personal values. The investor deal that Natalia presented ultimately closed successfully and provided capital for the company's global expansion that has made it even more successful. But Rodrigo will tell anyone who asks that the real transformation wasn't in the business metrics, but in his understanding of what actually matters and what kind of leader and father and partner he wants to be. The deeper truth of this story goes far beyond the extraordinary circumstances of that one night, though those events certainly catalyzed important change. The real lesson is about the courage required to set boundaries and maintain integrity, even when doing so risks professional consequences, about recognizing that people who work for us are complete human beings with their own families and obligations and values, rather than just being resources to deploy in service of business objectives. It teaches us that true leadership includes being willing to let go of control and trust others, to step up and handle important responsibilities even when it's terrifying and when the stakes are high. That sometimes the people we consider junior or less important actually possess remarkable capabilities and character that we fail to see because we're too focused on titles and hierarchies. This story reminds us that caregiving responsibilities, whether for children or disabled siblings or elderly parents, are not weaknesses or distractions to apologize for, but rather are fundamental human obligations that deserve respect and accommodation in workplace cultures. That companies and leaders who fail to recognize this are ultimately weaker and less effective because they lose talented people or fail to get the best from employees who are exhausted and conflicted from impossible demands to choose between work and family. It shows us that moments of crisis and vulnerability often reveal character and create opportunities for genuine connection and transformation that would never emerge during normal business-as-usual periods when everyone maintains professional masks and distances. Most fundamentally, this story teaches that dedication and commitment to work are admirable qualities, but that they must be balanced against other values, including family, health, integrity, and basic human kindness, that a life devoted entirely to professional achievement while sacrificing relationships and personal well-being is ultimately empty and unfulfilling, regardless of external markers of success. It reminds us that the people who make extraordinary sacrifices to help us succeed deserve not just financial compensation, but genuine appreciation and respect and consideration of their needs and circumstances. That loyalty and commitment should flow both ways in workplace relationships, rather than being one-directional demands from powerful to less powerful. If this story moved you and made you think about your own priorities and whether you're honoring your commitments to family while also pursuing professional goals, please leave a like on this video so I know this content resonates with you. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss future stories about people demonstrating extraordinary character, about workplaces that value human dignity alongside productivity, about transformation through vulnerability and genuine connection. And please share in the comments your own experiences with impossible choices between work and family, or times when someone went above and beyond to help you through a crisis, or ways you've tried to create better balance and boundaries in your own life. Because your stories encourage all of us to keep striving to align our daily actions with our deepest values and to treat everyone around us with the dignity and respect they deserve.